Alright everybody, welcome back to the Nietzsche playlist. I believe in the last video we talked about the first part of Nietzsche's On the Use and Abuse of History. We talked about antiquarian history, monumental history, Montclaim's monument, and critical history. Basically discussing how, whether it's a historian or a government or just an individual person, or we looked at the example of the license plates in Quebec, how they use historical events to build the identity of a person or a place or a people, how they highlight and celebrate, sometimes even to the point of inaccuracy, various events or saints or generals in wars to inspire people or help articulate beliefs about greatness or other things in the world, or use historical events either as warnings against going down certain paths, often again through, I keep using this word, cartoonifying or some form of exaggeration, maybe inaccuracy. Rome fell because it didn't have enough dependent housewives. Oh no, this kind of thing. Or conversely highlighting, positive things throughout history that, maybe one day we can try to emulate, but probably not because nobody ever actually learns from the past. So in this video, I want to talk about something that's a little bit more in depth, a little bit more philosophical and rich. And this comes from the 6th section of The Use and Abuse of History for Life by Friedrich Nietzsche. What I'm going to do is just read the whole section. It's about it's actually about 6 pages. And I might cut large parts of it out, depending on how much of it I can actually comprehend enough to talk about, because otherwise it'll just be here. This will just be an audiobook, right? So, when we get to, especially towards the end of this passage, there are some insights that I think, if somehow they were commonly understood, would probably change the world for the better. But I don't know, maybe I'm just being a nerd. Okay, but leaving these weaklings, he's talking about modern personalities in the previous section. He believed that modern people were weak, I guess because they criticized everything that they couldn't live up to, although I haven't read the previous section recently, so take that with a grain of salt. But leaving these weaklings, let's turn rather to a point of strength, for which the modern man is much praised. Let us ask the painful question, whether he has the right, in virtue of his historical objectivity, to call himself strong and just in a higher degree than the man of another age. Okay, so the subject here is objectivity and subjectivity. And what he's talking about here is, in some respects, this is especially evident in the academic discipline of history. We will be unbiased. We will be like, the historians themselves, using the monumental character of Herodotus, who is, he is famously unbiased. Whether he actually was or not, we'd have to read the damn text, right? Nobody's going to do that. But certainly in the mythos of academic history, Herodotus is the first historian because he was objective. He didn't write myths about the kings of Sumer, of Greece, like the Sumerians might have, or whoever else. And in this way, we have this to this day, even outside of the academic discipline of history, this sense that, look at the primary sources and be objective. What really happened? And what Nietzsche's going to critique, and what I think we should critique as well, is the extent to which this can get basically out of hand. You have people, breaking down screenshots from historical films and saying, well, in a real medieval suit of armor, they wouldn't have this, cloth sticking out to the right. It would be sticking out to the left in a real historian, and it's like, okay, at a certain point, we've kind of lost the point. If we're just trying to recreate the past exactly, at that point, why are we even alive still if we need the past that bad? You know what I'm saying? But that doesn't mean that we discard any care about evidence and objectivity at all. In fact, Nietzsche starts us off by saying, hey, is objectivity a strength? Let's investigate. It is true that this objectivity has its source in a heightened sense in the need for justice. Okay, I think this is a typo. I think because that question in this edition ends with a question mark, but I think it's supposed to say, is it true that this objectivity has its source in a heightened sense of the need for justice, or being really an effect of quite other causes? Does it have only the appearance of coming from justice and really lead to an unhealthy prejudice in favor of the modern man? Socrates thought it near madness to imagine that one possessed a virtue without really possessing it. Such imagination has certainly more danger in it than the contrary madness of a positive vice. For there is still a cure for this, but the other makes a man or a time daily worse, and therefore more unjust. So he's probably going to question either whether our modern preference for objectivity is sincere, or whether it's really virtuous. No one has a higher claim to our reverence than the man with the feeling and the strength for justice. For the highest and rarest virtues unite and are lost in it, as an unfathomable sea absorbs the streams that flow from every side. The hand of the just man who is called to sit in judgment trembles more when it holds the scales. He piles the weights inexorably against his own side. His eyes are not dimmed as the balance rises and falls, and his voice is neither hard nor broken when he pronounces the sentence. So he's kind of describing the details of what this virtue towards objectivity is. You're stacking the evidence against your own side. You're considering both of the views, and you don't have a biased tone in your voice when you speak about it. This reminds me of like sports commentators when they obviously have a favorite team, right? And it's obvious in their commentary who they want to win. And there's like whatever YouTube compilations where the announcer is just actively losing it and getting mad at the refs for calling against their team, or even like cursing on the air when they realize their team is lost. And we find this funny, or we have a sense that it's wrong because you're a commentator. You should give us an objective picture of the match. But I think what Nietzsche's going to start to talk about a bit here is like, isn't that kind of weird? Because is there a person who naturally watches sports and is completely unbiased? Maybe if you don't care about the sport, but why would you want a commentator that didn't care about the sport, right? And so this is the contradiction that Nietzsche is going to start to unravel. Were he a cold demon of knowledge, he would cast around him in the icy atmosphere of an awful superhuman majesty that we should fear, not reverence. Right? It's kind of inhumane to be completely unbiased. But he is a man, and he has tried to rise from a careless doubt to a strong certainty, from a gentle tolerance to the imperative thou must, from the rare virtue of magnanimity to the rarest of justice. He has come to be like that demon without being more than a poor mortal at the outset. Above all, he has to atone to himself for his humanity and tragically shatter his own nature on the rock of an impossible virtue. Right? When you try to be objective above all else, you are doing something that's impossible, while at the same time abandoning, Nietzsche will probably elaborate this more, what virtue and strength you did have, even in your bias, that you're now neglecting in the name of objectivity, which you can't achieve. All this places him on a lonely height as the most reverent example of the human race, for truth is his aim, not the form of cold, ineffectual knowledge, but the truth of the judge who punishes according to law, not as the selfish possession of an individual, but the sacred authority that removes the boundary stones from all self-possessions, truth, in a word, as the tribunal of the world, and not as the chance prey of a single hunter. Right, this goes back to the very first video I did about Nietzsche, where I talked about that this is one of Nietzsche's primary concerns, that our emotional relationship to truth and our general inability to acknowledge the fact that we are not as easily capable of being innocently interested in the truth as we sometimes claim to be. Its roots are injustice alone, but a whole crowd of different motives may combine in the search for it that have nothing to do with truth at all. Curiosity, for example, or dread of ennui, envy, vanity, or amusement. Thus the world seems to be full of men who serve truth, and yet the virtue of justice is seldom present, more seldom known, and almost always mortally hated. Right, that's what I just said, except Nietzsche was being a lot more direct, and he said it with more character. On the other hand, a throng of sham virtues has entered in at all times with pomp and honor. Few, in truth, serve truth, as only few have the pure will for justice, and very few even of these have the strength to be just. The will alone is not enough. The impulse to justice without the power of judgment has been the cause of the greatest suffering to men, and thus the common good could require nothing better than for the seed of this power to be strewn as widely as possible, that the fantastic may be distinguished from the true judge and the blind desire from the conscious power. Okay, so this actually might be, there's a way in which this is maybe demotivating and hard for some people to hear, but there's also a way in which I think it can be liberating. So on the one hand, he's saying that most people just aren't capable of living with and for the truth. Even most of the people that want to aren't capable of acknowledging the truth. They just don't have the strength for it. That's harsh. Probably he means most of us, even if we're like into philosophy or whatever. Sorry, but you're too weak. You can't handle the truth, right? This is the hard truth that maybe we also can't handle. And so that is harsh. That is hard, I think, for people to hear. But the silver lining and the positive spin on that is that it does lift a big burden of responsibility off our shoulders. If we kind of take Nietzsche's idea here to its conclusion, it would mean that those of us without the strength for truth and justice, which is probably most of us, therefore shouldn't falsely try to live up to that, and maybe easier virtues, which might just be, I don't like Voltaire, but as Voltaire said, cultivating your own garden, living in your bias just with a little bit of lightness, right? Acknowledging that there is a greater truth out there, and so being gentle with people who have a different bias, but not leaving your bias. And then that would be maybe easier to do, right? And so we now don't have to be as stressed about trying to live up to a justice that is just out of our reach, right? And that means we can have entertaining sports commentators that get mad when something doesn't go their way, right? Which is probably funner to watch than somebody just being a robot saying objectively what happened and here are all the statistics. Like, who wants to watch that, right? There are no means of planting a power of judgment. And so when one speaks to men of truth and justice, they will be ever troubled by the doubt whether it be the fanatic or the judge who is speaking to them. They must be pardoned for always treating the servants of truth with special kindness, who possess neither the will nor the power to judge, and have set before them the task of finding pure knowledge without reference to consequences. Knowledge, in plain terms, that comes to nothing. There are very many truths which are unimportant, problems that require no struggle to solve, to say nothing of sacrifice. And in this safe realm of indifference, a man may very successfully become a cold demon of knowledge. And yet, if we find the whole regiments of the learned inquirers being turned to such demons in some age especially favorable to them, it is always unfortunately possible that the age is lacking in a great and strong sense of justice, the noblest spring of the so-called impulse to truth. Right? Also notice that Nietzsche is connecting the ideas of truth and justice. For him, they're almost inseparable, it sounds like, from these paragraphs. Consider the historical virtuoso of the present time. Is he the greatest man of his age? True, he has developed in himself such a delicacy and sensitiveness that nothing human is alien to him. Times and persons most widely separated come together in the concords of his lyre. He has become a passive instrument whose tones find an echo in similar instruments until the whole atmosphere of a time is filled with such echoes, all buzzing in one soft chord. Okay, so Nietzsche has lots of stylistic flourishes. Maybe on this first read-through, we're not going to comprehend all of that. Let's just try to focus on not getting lost from the point while he does that stylistic stuff. Yet I think one hears only the overtones of the original historical note. Its rough, powerful quality can no longer be guessed from these thin and shrill vibrations. The original note sang of action, need, and terror. The overtone lulls us into a soft, dilettante sleep. So the original note of history is urgent and very lively, which certainly colloquially is not how historical texts are usually characterized. It is as though the heroic symphony has been arranged for two flutes for the use of dreaming opium smokers. We can now judge these virtuosi. We can now judge how these virtuosi stand toward the claim of the modern man to a higher and purer conception of justice. The virtue never has a pleasing quality. It never charms. It is harsh and strident. This is an interesting critique of the virtue of objectivity. It never has a pleasing quality. That's something Nietzsche thinks is wrong with it. Generosity stands very low on the ladder of the virtues in comparison, and generosity is the mark of a few rare historians. Most of them get only as far as tolerance. In other words, they leave what cannot be explained away. They correct it and touch it up condescendingly, on the tacit assumption that the novice will count it as justice if the past be narrated without harshness or open expression of hatred. But only superior strength can really judge. Weakness must tolerate it if it does not pretend to be strength and turn justice into a play actress. Okay, so these are the inner workings kind of how these historians use their objectivity and how there is maybe some dishonesty in that. There is still a dreadful class of historians remaining clever, stern, and honest, but narrow-minded, who have the goodwill to be just with a pathetic belief in their actual judgments, which are all false, for the same reason almost as the verdicts of usual juries are usually false. How difficult it is to find a real historical talent if we exclude all the disguised egoists and the partisans who pretend to take up an impartial attitude for the sake of their own unholy gain, right? Wouldn't we agree that, I'd rather have somebody who is a partisan and revealed through their speech that they were a partisan than somebody who was a partisan who pretended to be objective, right? That's a little bit more insidious. It's harder to critique. It's also harder to understand what they're even trying to do, what they're even saying, because their objectivity, if they're not impartial, their pretend objectivity is ultimately probably just going to be aimed towards their subjective opinion anyway. It's just going to be harder to make sense of what they're even doing now. It's just going to become more complicated. And the reason I love this essay so much is that kind of thing happens all the time. It's not just in historical writing. Of course, it's on the news everywhere. It's probably one of the foundations of propaganda to say one thing and mean another, like these things, advertising. This has probably been utilized. I think this is a really important essay. And we also exclude the thoughtless folk who write history in the naive faith that justice resides in the popular view of their time, and that to write in the spirit of the time is to be just, a faith that is found in all religions, and which in religion serves very well, the measurement of the opinions and deeds of the past by the universal opinions of the present is called objectivity by these simple people. So for those of us, and sometimes, and I say us because sometimes, I am influenced by the thinking of the time in which I'm raised, who hold the belief, and maybe it seems so fundamental that we don't even notice that it's a belief, that some element of the present is true or just or right. When we then talk about the past where they believed something else, and we, talk shit about what they believed in the past, we still see that as objective because we're coming from this enlightened contemporary perspective. Even though we're talking shit about something, it's obviously not objective, right? They find the canon of a dull truth here. Their work is to adapt the past to the present triviality, and they call all historical writing subjective that does not regard these popular opinions as canonical. Might not an illusion lurk in the highest interpretation of the word objectivity? We understand it by a certain standpoint in the historian, who sees the procession of motive and consequence too clearly for it to have an effect on his own personality. We think of the aesthetic phenomenon of the detachment from all personal concern with which the painter sees a picture and forgets himself in a stormy landscape, amid thunder and lightning, or on a rough sea, and we require the same artistic vision and absorption in his object from the historian. But it is only a superstition to say that the picture given to such a man by the object really shows the truth of things, unless it be that objects are expected in such moments to paint or photograph themselves by their own activity on a purely passive medium. So I think that's a really key passage. I'm not wrapping my head around it fully, but this is an interesting comparison that Nietzsche will return to between the artist and the historian. The artist, especially the naturalistic painter, who tries to capture or even you might think of like a photographer, who tries to capture the scene how it is when we want like a photograph of a historical moment. And photographs were new in Nietzsche's time, so I don't know how much he was thinking about this. He might have been a little. We have a sense that the photograph, or even like a really naturalistic painting, will capture something as it is, but the lighting, the perspective, what's included and not included in the frame, this all has to do with. This can all limit the objective power of the painting. And so even if the historian could do that, that would be a limitation for them too. But I also don't think I'm fully grasping what Nietzsche was saying there. But this would be a myth, and a bad one at that. One forgets that this moment is actually the powerful and spontaneous moment of creation in the artist, of composition in its highest form, of which the result will be an artistically, but not a historically, true picture. To think objectively, in this sense, of history is the work of the dramatist, to think one thing with another and weave the elements into a single whole, with the presumption that the unity of plan must be put into the objects if it is not already there. So man veils and subdues the past and expresses his impulse to art, but not his impulse to truth or justice. The historian is a storyteller, a dramatist, an artist. Objectivity and justice have nothing to do with each other. There could be a kind of historical writing that had no drop of a common fact in it, yet could claim to be called, in the highest degree, objective. Grill Parser, so he's going to cite an actual historian here, goes so far as to say that history is nothing but the manner in which the spirit of man apprehends facts that are obscure to him, links things together whose connection heaven only knows, replaces the unintelligible by something intelligible, puts his own ideas of causation into the external world, which can perhaps be explained only from within, and assumes the existence of chance where thousands of small causes may really be at work. Each man has his own individual needs, and so millions of tendencies are running together, straight or crooked, parallel or across, forward or backward, helping or hindering each other. They have all the appearance of chance and make it impossible, quite apart from all natural influences, to establish any universal lines on which past events may have run. So that wasn't Nietzsche. That was actually a quote from whoever this guy is, Grill Parser. And that is one of the essential points of this essay. If you were to try to write an objective history, it would be unreadable. There are too many things to keep track of. And there's also just a lot of guesswork about, like, oh, this is what caused the First World War. Like, you know, people make YouTube videos and they've probably made essays about what were the principal causes of the 30 Years' War. Or often it's about wars, you know, what caused this war, what caused that war. Why did the Roman Empire last so long? And then we come up with all of these explanations and all these theories, and they're all, it's not just that they're wrong. Many of them, most of them probably are wrong, but it's that each of these theories, oftentimes, not all the time, sometimes there might be people innocently interested, but oftentimes the theories of why Rome fell aren't primarily about why Rome fell. They're about what that person thinks is good about a society. And so they want to find something they think is bad about society and use and say that that is what explains why Rome fell or why World War I started. And it might not be nefarious, like, oh, I'm going to blame World War I on somebody. It might be, hey, I came up with this cool theory, and I think this cool theory I came up with explains World War I. And now it's like a personal sense of pride, like, I want my theory to explain it. Anyway, now back to what Nietzsche is saying, but as a result of this so-called objective way of looking at things, such a must ought to be made clear. It is a presumption that takes a curious form if adopted by the historian as a dogma. Schiller, this is a German dramatist, is quite clear about its truly subjective nature when he says of the historian, one event after the other begins to draw away from blind chance and lawless freedom and take its place as a member of a harmonious whole, which is of course only apparent in its presentation. But what is one to think of the innocent statement, wavering between tautology and nonsense, of a famous historical virtuoso? He's quoting from somebody here. Quote, "It seems that all human actions and impulses are subordinate to the process of the material world, which works unnoticed, powerfully and irresistibly." Okay, so I think I'll have to look, I don't know if this will reveal itself, but is he quoting a specific historian who's saying, the natural world explains history? And you do see that belief sometimes. Oh, you know, this war started because of a shortage of resources, right? Well, is the solution to a shortage of resources always war, or always specifically this war? What about the possibility that the king or the general was just really impatient or really, ambitious and used the shortage of resources as a pretext? Oh, there's too much population in this area, and there's, social classes leading to unrest. Well, does the psychology of the people within those social classes play no part in it? I'm going to go back to the essay because I think I'm lowering the quality of the explanation here with my attempt to elaborate it. In such a sentence, one no longer finds obscure wisdom in the form of obvious folly, as in the saying of Goethe's gardener, Nature may be forced, but not compelled. Or in the notice on the side show at the fair in Swift, the largest elephant in the world would expect himself to be seen here. For what opposition is there between human action and the process of the world? It seems to me that such historians cease to be instructive as soon as they begin to generalize, Their weakness is shown by their obscurity. In other sciences, the generalizations are the most important things, as they contain the laws. But if such generalizations as these are to stand as laws, the historian's labor is lost. For the residue of truth, after the obscure and insoluble part is removed, is nothing but the commonest knowledge. This is an interesting point. In physics, when Einstein comes up with a general theory of relativity, or the law of gravity is explained, you're reducing the physical world of natural processes to these laws. And Nietzsche's saying that works in science because you can mathematically calculate gravity, but in the realm of human history, it's less of a science. There are people who try to come up with theories of history's like inevitable structure. People say history is cyclical. People say history is linear. It's progressive. It's leading to some teleological end. There's an interesting lecturer on YouTube who says that history is about intersecting cyclones of nomads, and especially like warlike nomads like the Mongols, the Vikings, and more static empires colliding with each other. And this explains history. Nietzsche's saying that, and actually that's maybe a more sophisticated articulation of some kind of pattern or law for the grand sense of history. Nietzsche is skeptical here that there can be such a pattern to explain human history. And also, what he's specifically saying is that there are laws. There is a truth about how history works, but it is nothing but the commonest knowledge. Quote, the smallest range of experience will teach it. But to worry whole peoples for the purpose and spend many hard years of work on it is like the crowding of one scientific experiment on another long after the law can be deduced from the results already obtained. And this absurd excess of experiment has been the bane of all natural science since Zollner. Okay, so now he's saying specific things about the history of science that I don't know who Zollner is, right? Okay, if the value of a drama lay merely in its final scene, the drama itself would be a very long, crooked, and laborious road to the goal. And I hope history will not find its whole significance in general propositions and regard them as its blossoms and fruit. On the contrary, its real value lies in inventing ingenious variations on a popular commonplace theme, in raising the popular melody to a universal symbol, and showing what a world of depth, power, and beauty exists in it. So this is another key passage. He's been questioning the historian's reliance on objectivity to this point. Now he's providing an alternative. Instead of objectivity, what he's basically saying is the historian should consider themselves a dramatist, taking the existing understanding of history that the people have and enriching it. He appeals to beauty. Okay, but this requires, above all else, a great artistic faculty, a creative vision from a height, a loving study of the data of experience, a free elaborating of a given type. Objectivity, in fact, though this time as a positive quality. Objectivity is so often merely a phrase. Instead of the quiet gaze of the artist that is lit by an inward flame, we have an affectation of tranquility, just as a cold detachment may mask a lack of moral feeling. In some cases, a triviality of thought, the everyday wisdom that is too dull not to seem calm and disinterested, comes to represent the artistic condition in which the subjective side has quite sunk out of sight. Okay, I want to pause for the aim of not getting lost in that Nietzsche's very dense and detailed insights here. This is a really important passage, especially what's about to come up. Nietzsche, who's to this point has been basically disparaging objectivity, now he's going to highlight a positive conception of objectivity. by actually kind of defining it differently than it's typically understood. So he's not against objectivity in historians or in general, but he thinks objectivity is not about detachment and distance, right? We sort of think, well, to be objective, you have to step back and look at it from a broader perspective. What Nietzsche is saying is that it's not so much that as much as it is a passion for everything that is happening. So while somebody simplistically biased might be passionate about one side of the argument or one side of the event, and then we think an objective person is detached from such a bias, I think what Nietzsche is really about to drive home is that actually objectivity is probably more like being passionate about both sides instead of being detached from them. So he continues, and this is with respect to our traditional conception of objectivity, quote, "Everything is favored that does not rouse emotion, and the driest phrase is the correct one. They go so far as to accept a man who is not affected at all by some particular moment in the past as the right man to describe it," right? Because the person who's not affected by it, well, they aren't biased because they weren't there, so they can speak about it objectively. Meanwhile, do you hear what you just said? They weren't there, and you think they're the best person to talk about the event? What? Right? This is the usual relation of the Greeks and classical scholars. Okay, actually, before we continue, this is talked about when you study history because it's like, you'll look at a primary source, and historians like primary sources because those are the people who were there, right? They saw the event, right? But as soon as they then read the primary source from like ancient times, the first thing they'll then say is, well, okay, now they're biased, right? Because we can't take this this historical source too seriously because, you know, they were heavily biased against this other person, this other tribe or whatever. And that's true. It's not like we should take all of these historical sources at face value, but isn't their bias also an important part of the story as well? This is the usual relation of the Greeks and classical scholars. They have nothing to do with each other, and this is called objectivity, the intentional air of detachment that is assumed for effect. The sober art of the superficial motive hunter is most operating when the highest and rarest things are in question, and it is the vanity of the historian that drives him to this attitude of indifference. He serves to justify the axiom that man's vanity corresponds to his lack of wit. No, be honest at any rate. Do not pretend to the artist's strength. That is the real objectivity. Do not try to be just if you were not born to that dread vocation, as if it were the task of every time to be just to everything before it. Ages and generations never have the right to be the judges of all previous ages and generations. Only to the rarest men in them can that difficult mission fall. Who compels you to judge? If it is your wish, you must prove first that you are capable of justice. As judges, you must stand higher than that which is to be judged. As it is, you have come only later. The guests that come last to the table should rightly take the last places, and you will take the first? Then do some great and mighty deed. The place may be prepared for you then, even though you do come last. That might be one of my favorite nonfiction paragraphs of all time. Human history had humans in it. And like usually when you meet other people in life, you have a sense that you have to treat them with respect. Usually, ideally you have that sense. And we know that within our own time, like you can't just, there's a pecking order, right? There's a hierarchy, an existing set of rules and accomplishments put out by the people before you. We can understand in our own time about having some humility about that. But all the people throughout the previous ages of human history are dead. And so they can't stand up to you if you speak ill of them. And so there's nothing, sadly, there's nothing stopping us from badly downplaying and misrepresenting people who can no longer speak for themselves to clarify. No, that you're not understanding what I believed in properly. You're not understanding what I really did, what I really stood for. Anyway, I don't want to over-explain it because, like I said, that paragraph, this is on page 40 of the Dover Thrift editions. It starts on page 39. Edition of Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History. This, I feel like, this should be a famous passage. It's not, I don't think, and that's very sad to me. Okay, so we've got a little under 2 pages left. This is going to be a long episode, but that's okay. You can explain the past only by what is most powerful in the present. Only by straining the noblest qualities you have to their highest power will you find out what is greatest in the past, most worth knowing and preserving, like by like. Otherwise, you will draw the past down to your own level. Do not believe any history that does not spring from the mind of a rare spirit. Okay, so this contains within it a premise that is probably controversial. Nietzsche believes that people of centuries past were better, stronger, wiser than people of his time. There is an air of superiority, even in very high level, university academic historical discussions, where we're taught to believe that now with our technology, now with our democracy, see how long that lasts, now with all our insight, now that we can look back so far, we're better, we're more informed. We have the internet now. They didn't have that advantage, just taking it for granted that it's an advantage, even though in many ways I think it's a disadvantage, with pros and cons, of course. And I think that this is, for different reasons, it's a discussion for another day. This is true in many respects. You can look at simple things like how many people know how to shoe a horse, probably some ranchers, and that's it. Whereas it used to be that many people would have had at least some basic idea of it. So you can look at things like that. We're losing skills of how to forage, right? And we typically I don't like thinking about just how complicated and how intensely robust the knowledge of like a hunter-gatherer is, of the different plants and what they're used for and which are poisonous and how to actually extract the medicinal things that you need from them. Like, we typically think of hunter-gatherers as like cave people, as like completely unintelligent, but we all know this. If I had to go survive in the woods, I would die, and someone with that sophisticated knowledge of the land would not. And that means that they're, at least with regards to this really important thing called nature, they're more knowledgeable. And they're more knowledgeable by orders of magnitude. Like, it's not even close. I am a child. I am a toddler with my knowledge of shrubbery compared to a hunter-gatherer person, right? And so I'm not better than them. And I might be, at least if you care about knowledge of the woods, I might be orders of magnitude stupider and worse. And it's true that is not easy for us to hear. Maybe that's why that passage is not famous. But anyway, like by like. Otherwise, you will draw the past down to your own level. Right? And that's disrespectful. Do not believe any history that does not spring from the mind of a rare spirit. You will know the quality of the spirit by its being forced to say something universal, or to repeat something that is known already. The fine historian must have the power of coining the known into a thing never heard before, and proclaiming the universal so simply and profoundly that the simple is lost in the profound, and the profound in the simple. No one can be a great historian and artist, and a shallow pate at the same time. But one must not despise the workers who sift and cast together the material, because they can never become great historians. Still less must they confound with them, for they are the necessary bricklayers and apprentices that serves the master, just as the French used to speak more natively than a German would of the historians de M. Thiers. Of the historian de M. Thiers. Yeah, I obviously don't speak French. These workmen should gradually become extremely learned, but never for that reason turn to be masters. Great learning and great shallowness go very well together under one hat. I almost considered naming one of my YouTube channels Under One Hat because of that passage, but that's besides the point. It's called to humility, right? You can be stupid and learned at the same time. Now, so this is an important caveat. It seems like Nietzsche has spoken very harshly towards historians, but he is acknowledging that there is a type of academic who will, for example, the archaeologists who uncover the Sumerian tablets and translate them for the first time, right? Samuel Noah Kramer, for example, may not have been a great artistic genius, but his contributions and some of his, history begins at Sumer, some of these oversimplifications might become, outdated. But his contribution to uncovering these texts, translating them, traveling between universities, where in this university they had this fragment and in that university they had this fragment, so he had to cross the ocean to go to both and write what both of them said. That takes a lifetime to do that properly, and without his work, Sumerology would be 10 years, 20 years back from where it is now. And so that kind of scholarship is really important. There's a lot of critique of academia on YouTube, and I appreciate that. Sometimes, quite often, I went to university myself, and I won't go into it here, but I do have opinions about how some of the ambitions and attitudes of professional scholars are not, they don't live up to the prestige that an academic, a PhD is supposed to have in many respects. Is university worth it? In many situations, it probably isn't anymore. But translating texts for the first time between languages, even if it's not the greatest translation in the history of the world, compiling the sources and organizing them to be accessed and addressed by other people, this work is really beautiful and really, really something to be grateful for, that people often who aren't really thanked very much for it will spend their lifetimes sorting through these notes to find, one citation that's a needle in a haystack, right? So we shouldn't forget them. I also just want to add as a side note that in my university degree, I took many classes from different humanities departments: philosophy, English literature, history, religious studies, social sciences, fine arts. And in my opinion, every class was different. There were great professors in every discipline, but my opinion was that the best discipline, the one where you would learn the most, was history. Religious studies was maybe up there too. But even though I don't think the highest artistic vision or intelligence was always applied in history class, what the historian's method of being very rigorous about the citations, there can be a rigorousness of a different kind in academic philosophy as well. But sometimes I think that rigorousness can sadly be applied to, useless questions where you're just thinking around in circles sometimes. But with history, even if the final essay that you write about it is garbage, what you learn in the process of gathering those sources and reading texts from other times, and there is also like a certain, I think, humility that comes with being able to like imagine yourself, if you do it seriously, in another person's shoes in a different time. I think there's a lot to admire there. So while we are with this essay critiquing historians, take it with a grain of salt. I think there is a lot of great work that goes on there. Okay, thus history is to be written by the man of experience and character. He who has not lived through something greater and nobler than others will not be able to explain anything that is great and noble in the past. The language of the past is always oral, maybe. You will only understand it as builders of the future who know the present. We can explain the extraordinarily wide influence of Delphi only by the fact that the Delphic priests had an exact knowledge of the past, and similarly, only he who is building up the future has a right to judge the past. That's interesting. So the Delphic priests were good historians, maybe? Interesting. If you set a great aim before your eyes, you control at the same time the itch for analysis that makes the present into a desert for you, and all rest, all peaceful growth and ripening impossible. Head yourselves with a great all-embracing hope and strive on. Make of yourselves a mirror where the future may see itself, and forget the superstition that you are epigony. I don't know how to say that. You have enough to ponder and find out in pondering the life of the future, but do not ask history to show you the means and the instruments to it. You live yourselves back into the history of great men. If you live yourselves back into the history of great men, you will find it in the high command to come to maturity and leave that blighting system of cultivation offered by your time, which sees its own profit in allowing you to become ripe, that it may use and dominate you while you are yet unripe. And if you want biographies, do not look for those with the legend Mr. So-and-so and his times, but for those whose title page might be inscribed a fighter against his time. Feast your souls on Plutarch, and dare to believe in yourselves when you believe in his heroes. So here Nietzsche himself is advocating for monumental history. 100 such men, educated against the fashion of today, made familiar with the heroic, and come to maturity, are enough to give an eternal quietus to the noisy sham education of this time. So, that was section 6 of Nietzsche's On the Use and Abuse of History for Life. Like I said, I think it's one of the best pieces of nonfiction, of philosophy, of historical commentary ever. Yeah, I think certain passages from that should be famous. I hope that you got something out of it, and thank you for sticking to the end if that's something you did. I know this is a longer video than usual, and I hope you have a wonderful day.